Some Thoughts of the Past by John H. Johnson. I hope that all my children and grandchildren will not be too critical of the language I use. Just remember that I got my education at the sheep herd, in the school of hard knocks. My father was Joel Hills Johnson. He was born March 23rd, 1802, in Grafton, Massachusetts. Here's a little bit of his story.
When I was a small child, my parents immigrated to the state of Vermont, where they lived about 9 years. In the year of 1813, my parents let me go with my uncle Joel Hills, for whom I was named, to Newport in the state of Kentucky, on the opposite side of the Ohio River from Cincinnati. In the spring of 1815, my father came and took me to Pomfret, New York, where I lived with him until I was 21 years of age. I bought a sawmill and a lot of land and built a house. My sisters kept house for me until the second day of November 1826, when I married Anna Pixley Johnson. About this time, there was a considerable excitement about the Mormons at Kirtland, where there had been a branch of the church built up, and Joseph Smith had arrived at that place and held a conference and was sending out elders through the country. I obtained the Book of Mormon and read it. I accordingly came to the conclusion to take my Bible in hand and attend all their meetings and investigate the subject thoroughly, comparing their preachings with the Scriptures. I concluded that the work was of God and embraced with all my heart and soul, and was baptized on the first day of June 1831 by Elder Sylvester Smith. I helped to organize the Kirtland camp in 1838 and traveled with it as far as Springfield, Illinois. There I commenced preaching and soon gathered a branch of the church of 40 members over which I presided until 8th of January 1839, when the Lord showed me by revelation that I must immediately go to Carthage in Hancock County. I packed up, went with my family, and commenced preaching in Carthage and vicinity, and baptized many and organized a branch of the church of about 50 members called the Crooked Creek Branch. Late one night, after Joseph and Hiram Smith were killed, I was called to the door by an armed mob of about 100 men who told me if I was not gone by the first day of June, my life would be taken and my property destroyed. Out of $4,000 or $5,000 worth of property that I owned in Hancock County, all that I could raise to help me get away was one horse team worth only $75, one yoke of oxen, and a borrowed wagon. We arrived in Salt Lake City in October 1848. In 1851, I was sent by George A. Smith to the Springs, 12 miles south of Parowan, to make a fort, myself a farm, and herd the stock for Parowan and Cedar City. The same is still called Fort Johnson. In the spring of 1857, I was called on a mission to Florence, Nebraska, on the Missouri River. My labors were mostly in preaching to the people in Iowa and presiding at Genoa in Nebraska.
My mother was Margaret Threlkeld. She was born in Carlisle, England on July 21st, 1840, to John and Elizabeth Threlkeld. When she was 12 years old, Margaret worked in a textile mill, keeping bobbins filled for the spinners. One night after work, Margaret heard some Mormon missionaries singing on a street corner. She stopped to listen and then invited them to her home. Her entire family was baptized before Margaret's 13th birthday. For the next 4 years, the family worked and saved, planning for the day that they could travel to Utah. In 1857, the family booked passage for Boston. They continued their trip by rail and arrived in Iowa in May. There they purchased oxen, wagons, clothing, and provisions necessary in making the long trek across the plains. Things did not go well during this trip. The company was small and there was much bickering and quarreling among the travelers. By the end of June, the party reached Florence, Nebraska. Between the difficulty of the journey and feeling that they had been cheated by members of their company, Margaret's parents decided there that they would return to England. Margaret and her sister Mary Jane were determined to continue to Utah, so they hid until their parents had left. It was there in Nebraska that my parents met. My mother and her sister Mary Jane stayed in Florence and helped my father until he was ready to return to Utah. My parents, Joel Hills Johnson and Margaret Threlkeld, were married by Brigham Young on October 11, 1860. My father was 58 years old and my mother was 20. For the next several years, my parents helped settle several towns in southern Utah: Parowan, Virgin, Bellevue. My father grafted, raised, and sold fruit trees, and my mother raised a large garden and sold fresh and canned fruit and vegetables to a mining camp in Nevada. She also knitted hundreds of stockings, which she sold to the miners, besides cording the wool and knitting for her own family. She would spend all of her evenings knitting while her children took turns reading aloud. Her wrists became so lame that she had to have the knitting needles sewn into pieces of cloth and pinned to her sleeves. My family lived in Johnson Canyon, where I was born in 1881, and remained there until 1891. I was the youngest of 9 children. My father was 80 years old when I was born and died before I was 2. My mother was left with 6 children at home to support. We had a good ranch and put up lots of wild hay and milked lots of cows, sometimes 30 head of wild range cows. My job was to take the cows to the pasture about a mile away and round them up again at night. I was riding a horse and going it alone when I was 5 years old. When my older brothers and sisters got married and left, my mother sold the ranch and moved to Kanab, 14 miles away. There was just my brother Amos and I left. He was 14 years old and 4 years older than me. He went off to work and told me to stay home and take care of Mother, and he would make the living. He was a good cowhand and worked in House Rock Valley and on the Buckskin Mountain, and only came home 3 or 4 times a year. In the fall of 1894, Amos got a bunch of wild cattle off the mountain and was chasing them down the valley. His horse fell down with him and rolled over him. We don't know how long he lay there, but later the other cowboys bringing pack horses off the mountain found him. Amos never fully got over that experience. They brought him home, and the next spring he thought he could work again. He took a herd of sheep to run and took me along to help him. In 2 weeks he had to go home and left me alone with the sheep. 12 days later I went home for his funeral, then went back and took his place and ran that sheep herd all summer. When I was 14 years old, that is when my real experience in this life began. I was on my own. I worked steady either with sheep or on a road gang building the road from Kanab to Fredonia. In 1895 my mother moved to Tropic, where my brother Joseph and my sister Hannah Shumway lived. I met a number of boys from Tropic. They sang Tropic praises and got me interested. I went to Tropic and stayed with my brother several days, where I first met Estella. It was love at first sight for both of us. I had a girl in Kanab that I thought I loved very much, but when I met Estella, I soon forgot the other girl. Then it was not hard for Mother to get me to stay in Tropic.
My father, John Michael Ahlstrom, was born in Burlington, Iowa, as his family was emigrating from Sweden to Utah. My mother, Sarah Gila Cherry, came from England to Utah when she was 10 years old. My parents met in Ephraim, Utah, and were married in 1879. I was born in Ephraim, November 30th, 1882. Father went to Colorado for a year and worked on the railroad. He then took up a homestead 4 miles west of Ephraim, across the Sandpitch River, but drought forced them to leave there, so Father and Uncle Ole went into the sheep business and came to Garfield County, Utah. Our family spent 2 summers at the sheep camp. It was very beautiful then, with grass, wild fruit, and flowers everywhere. The creek was quite a big stream then, with many big holes where fishing was good. We salted down fish in 5-gallon kegs and dried service berries to take home with us for winter. We sold our house in Ephraim and came to Tropic, Utah in June 1892. Flash floods were a danger for ranchers in southern Utah. Rainstorms far away would cause a flood of mud and debris to come rushing down dry creek beds. Father was taking his sheep down the Paria Creek one fall when a flash flood came down while they were camped for the night, and Father lost 1,100 head of sheep. That put him out of the sheep business. He was many years paying off his debts. After getting out of the sheep business, Father farmed and helped Mother with the hotel, for his old home was the first hotel in Tropic and was called the Ahlstrom House for many years.
Now I'll tell you a little more about love and marriage. I said that I first saw Estella when I went to Tropic with my brother Joseph, who we called Dode. I only saw her then. I didn't meet her until May 1897, when I came over again to visit my mother. There was a dance, and I went again with Albert Meekum. I waited until I saw the little black-eyed girl come in. I asked to be introduced to her. Al went and got her and made me acquainted with her. I danced with her several tunes that night and then asked if I could walk her home. She said yes. I walked her home and we stood on the porch and goofed off for an hour, and then all at once I put my arm around her and it surprised her. She looked up at me so quick, and while her face was upturned I kissed her on the lips and said, "Good night, sweet girl," then left. The next time I saw her I apologized, and she said I didn't need to, as she had liked it as well as I did. Then we knew we were in love. At that time she was 14 years old and I was 16. We went together steady and only had trouble once, when I showed her a letter I had received from another girl in Kanab. She read it. It was a real live letter. After reading it, she looked me in the eye and said, "John, you make your choice between us right now." It made me mad, so I picked up my hat and said good night. For the next 3 weeks we were the two most miserable kids in the land. I went off to work and stayed there 3 weeks, then came home for a dance. It was Six Johnson's farewell dance when he went on his mission. Again I just sat and waited until my little black-eyed girl came in. I got her on the floor to dance. I danced with her for an hour, then I asked her to go for a walk with me. She did, and when we came back to the dance, we were the happiest couple in the whole world. She'd promised to be my wife, and she was only 15 years old. We waited nearly 3 more years before we got married, and how we did love each other. We were married on November 15th, 1900, standing on the front porch where we now live. My nephew, George W. Johnson, performed the ceremony, and oh, how happy we have been together all these years. Before long, Estella and I had 5 big, fine children of our own, and we had lost one. We took 2 more boys to raise, making us 7 kids. I was needed at home very badly. By 1909, my brother-in-law Dick Shumway was called on a mission. He rented me his sheep while he was gone. For the next 7 years, I lived at the sheep herd. Estella didn't know she had a man. My kids did not know they had a dad. But in those days, I made a mighty fine herd of sheep, about 3,000 head. My mother, who lived near us for many years, died December 23rd, 1914. I was her one worry because I was so rough. I had never done any work in the church. I drank some, but not to excess. I smoked and would swear a blue streak when angry. On March 26, 1916, lightning struck. I'll never forget that day. The stake president, who was James Houston, came to Tropic to make me bishop. I nearly fell dead. I'd never been on the stand. I'd never opened a meeting. I'd never dismissed a meeting. In fact, I had never done anything, so I refused to accept the job. So President Houston grabbed me by the arm and shook me and said, "John, you are going to be sustained as bishop of this ward in this very meeting, and you refuse at your own peril." I didn't think he would go through with it, but he did. After I'd been sustained by the people, the president called me to the stand. For the first time in my life, I gave a talk in public. My first talk didn't amount to much, but I did tell the people they would never have to worry about a preaching bishop. I made good on that promise. I couldn't turn bishop all at once. It was only a few weeks after I was made bishop that they held a stake conference in Panguitch. President Houston told me that I must be sure to be there. I told him I would if he would guarantee that I would not be called on to take part. At 10 o'clock Sunday morning, I went to church in the old tabernacle and took a seat in the back. President Houston saw me and came down after me to go up on the stand. I didn't want to. I said, "You promised me I wouldn't be called on for anything, so why go on the stand?" He said, "You won't be called on, but we want you on the stand." So I went up there and sat down with the other bishops. I was scared. I shook like a leaf in a windstorm. I don't know what went on, but before the meeting was out, President Houston said, "We will now hear from Bishop Johnson." I could only think of about a half-dozen words, and they were, "President Houston is a damn liar." I did get to my feet, but I could not talk. I mumbled a few words and sat down and dropped my head down on my hands. I never looked up during that meeting. I was so embarrassed. That evening, Arthur McAllister asked me to go to his home to stay. When I stepped in the door, he was talking to another man. He started to introduce me, and the other man said in a sneering way, "Oh, here is the man who preached to us today." I wanted to hit him on the jaw, and if he had been outside, I would have. I wouldn't shake hands with him. I went across the room and sat down and picked up a newspaper and pretended to read it, but I soon discovered that I had the paper upside down. It was only a little while until they called us in to supper. When I went into the dining room, I discovered the chairs were all turned around with their backs to the table. We all stood in our places. Then my friend said, "Bishop Johnson, will you lead in prayer?" Again, only a dozen words came to my mind. They were, "My friend is a damned hypocrite." All he wanted me to come to his house for was to embarrass me. We kneeled down at the table and I mumbled a few words. Then we sat down to the table. I couldn't look up. I noticed by my plate a little dish of olives. I noticed some of the others take one and put it in their mouth. I did the same thing. I never did like olives, and the minute it touched my lips, I turned deathly sick. I jumped up and ran for the door. As soon as I went out of that door, a voice said to me as plain as I've ever heard, "John, haven't you taken enough embarrassment for one day? If I were you, I would go and get on my horse and go home and tell the whole setup to go to hell." I answered that voice right out loud. I said, "That is just what I will do." My host came to the door to see what was the matter, and he wanted to know who I was talking to. I did not answer him. I just kept going. The place I was staying at was just north of the stake welfare building in Panguitch, so I was about 4 blocks from my horse. I went up that street as fast as I could walk. I crossed Main Street and bingo, something hit me right between the eyes, and it hit hard. I had to take a step backward to keep from falling. As soon as the stars quit falling and I could clear my head, I came up with both fists in fighting position and began to curse the man who had hit me, for I thought it was a man. I was a big stout cuss then, and I was not afraid of any man living in physical combat. Imagine my feeling and surprise when there was nobody around. Quickly I looked around and there was no one in sight. Then, almost petrified, I stood for a few minutes staring into space. All at once I heard a loud, shrill voice which called out, "John," just like my mother used to when I was a kid and got into trouble. That startled me. The fight I had for the next 2 hours between good and evil is more than I can tell. I didn't go any closer to my horse. I walked around town until I came back to where I started from. My host left the light burning in my room, and left the outside door to that room a little bit ajar. I could see my way in, so I went in and sat down on the bed for a time. I just stared into space. Then I began to cry like a little kid for a few minutes. I just sobbed like a baby. Then I thought how damn silly it looked for a big stout man to sit and whimper. Again I stared into space, when all at once from nowhere that lovely sweet voice said, "John, take your troubles to the Lord." Quick as a wink, I slid off my bed onto my knees. I dropped my head and arms onto the bed, and if ever a poor disheartened boy ever poured out his soul to the Lord, I did. I told him how I had refused to accept the job of bishop, how they forced it onto me, how they lied to me to get me to conference. I told him I was proud and couldn't take the embarrassment. I finished by saying, "O Lord, if it be your will that I should be bishop of the Lord, let me throw the whole thing off my mind and sleep the rest of the night." I undressed as quickly as I could and got into bed, and was asleep in 5 minutes. When I woke, the sun was shining into my window. I dressed as quickly as I could and went out into the living room. I felt like $1 million. I shook hands with my host. I also shook hands with the man who I felt like hitting on the jaw the night before. The man that I wanted to hit so bad was none other than John H. Taylor, a member of the First Council of 70. I now know that I had to be bishop. I knew the gospel was true. We all went to church together. I did not hesitate then to walk up to the stand and shake hands with all the brethren. From that day to this, I have no doubts in my mind. I have tried to be a good Latter-day Saint. I tried to raise my family right and teach them correct principles. I chose 2 young missionaries for my counselors, Maurice Cope as first and Samuel Pollock as second. We were all sustained that day together, and 18.5 years later we were all released together. That was quite a record. Not a change between March 1916 to September 1934. I think it was in 1920 or 1922 that I was elected county commissioner. I served 4 terms and worked like hell to get the present dump road built, and I hope to live to see it rebuilt and oiled. In 1933, our town was way in debt and had been for 20 years. I told the town board if they would make me president of the board, I would pay off all their debts in 2 years. I was just kidding, but my big mouth got me in trouble. I was made president of the board and made good in 2 years. With the help of the board of directors, we did not owe $1 and had a little money. I was made president of the Tropic and East Fork Irrigation Company, first in 1918, I think. I served as president for 18 out of the next 20 years. I was president when Tropic Reservoir was built and worked very hard to get that job done. On the 28th of October, 1941, I was at the Park Ranch. I plowed about 6 acres in the afternoon and started for home. It was about 23 miles through the roughs, and I couldn't go that way because it started to rain pitchforks at noon. It was 90 miles around by Alton, but I couldn't go that way because of the mud and blue clay. So I decided to go by way of Kanab. It was 150 miles that way. I put about a half load of wood to give me some weight, also my chains for traction, and took off about 2:30 in the afternoon. It was still raining and I could only drive about 15 miles an hour until I got to Johnson, the place where I was born. From there on the road was sandy and I poked along until I got over the Cedar Ridge, 6 miles from Kanab. There I stopped and rested a while and took off my chains, then started out a little faster. I hadn't gone a mile when a voice said to me, as plain as I'd ever heard a voice in my life, "John, slow up, there's a bad road ahead." And I did slow up for a ways. Then I started up again. The road I was on had been oiled, and the oil had broken up and a big hole was chipped out. The hole was 8 inches deep and about 3 feet across. When my right front wheel struck that hole, I was gone. My truck rolled over. It threw me out the door, and the truck stopped on top of me. Luckily, I was off the oil on the soft ground. I was out, but remember a voice telling me to dig. I had a gas barrel on top of the wood, which took part of the weight off from me. I started to dig under my hips where the weight was. I dug, but I was still unconscious. I kept digging with my fingers until the hole was big enough to take the weight off my body, and I crawled out from under the truck. I don't know how long I lay there with my head and shoulders leaning against the truck, and my feet and legs stretched out. The sun was not down when I tipped over, but just a while later after dark, some lights flashed in my face and I came to with a start. It was 2 boys about 15 years old. I told them to get me into their car and take me to the hospital. I was only about 3 miles out from Kanab. I don't know how they got me into the car, but they did. When they got me to the hospital, I came to just long enough to tell them who I was and who to call in Tropic, but I passed out again before they got me into bed. The doctor was off fishing, and it took about 3 hours to get Dr. Aiken there. He and the nurse, Oretta Heaton, worked with me for several hours until finally they said I was dead. They could not find a heartbeat or a pulse. The doctor finally went to the phone and called the undertaker and told him to come and get me. The undertaker asked who it was, and the doctor forgot my name, so he came back to the room and asked Oretta what my name was. I answered him. I told him my name was John Johnson. I'd regained consciousness, and they spent the rest of the night with me until the folks came. I lay in the hospital for 2 months. Then the doctor sent me home in an ambulance, and I was in bed for 2 more months before I got out on crutches. It was a year before I could walk without help. Gerald and Dutch, Ellis, and Bill Barker took care of the sheep as best they could, but I had to sell them in 1943. It was October 28, 1941 that I wrecked the truck and myself. I think I'd been a very successful sheep man for about 34 years, went through all the ups and downs of good and bad times, and I have no regrets. We are still living off from sheep money. In 1945, I was elected a member of the Garfield County Board of Education. In 1949, I think it was, I was made president of that board. We'd been saving all the money we could to build a schoolhouse in Tropic and Antimony. In 1950, we had $50,000 saved up, just enough to build a foundation. The board asked me what on earth we could do to get some money. Again, my big mouth got me into trouble. I said to them, "You fellows elect me to the state legislature and I will work like hell to get state aid for school buildings." In just a few weeks, I got word from the county clerk that my name had been filed for state representative. I think my son-in-law, Leslie Lefevre, took the position with 50 or more names on it and paid the $5 filing fee. I accepted it, and in November I was elected. Right then I went to work. I attended every meeting of the Legislative Council and made a lot of friends. When they would ask me what I wanted, my only answer was, I want you to recommend to the next legislature that they pass a bill giving state aid for school buildings in the needy counties. After the 5th or 6th time I met them and gave the same request, they asked me if I was going to keep coming back. I said yes until I get an answer. The buildings in Tropic, Antimony, Escalante, and Panguitch are concrete proof that we did get the money. I was one of the sponsors that introduced a bill in 1951 to appropriate $2 million. It passed in 1953. Arthur Bryan, the representative from Wayne County, and I got a bill to appropriate $2,150,000 to finish the job. That bill also passed, and the 1955 legislature set up $2 million more, so a lot of schoolhouses were built. I think those 2 terms in the legislature were almost the highlight of my life. Estella and I were the parents of 11 children. We also raised 2 foster sons. We first came to St. George in 1952 and have spent all the time we could in the winter months working in the temple. Estella and I worked in the temple until the 11th day of February 1962. My darling wife had a stroke early in the morning. I called the doctor as soon as I could, and we got her to the hospital. For 2 weeks we thought she might pull out of it. She lay there in St. George Hospital until the 16th of March. We decided to take her to Panguitch, to Dr. Duggins. We got Clive Bybee to come with his big station wagon, and we got her to Panguitch in fine shape. We felt quite relieved, but on the 20th day of March, Mom passed quietly away. She was buried in the Tropic Cemetery on March 24th, 1962. I just felt like the whole world had gone out from under me. We'd lived together for 61 and a half years, and they were happy years, for we loved each other as dearly in 1962 as we did in 1900. I just thought life had ended for me. But I came back to St. George in the temple. As soon as I could, I went to work, taking every session it was possible for me to get for nearly a year. When I began to associate with people a little more, I could see there was something left for me in the world that would be worth living for. In the winter of 1962, I don't remember the date, Alan Keller, the man with both legs cut off, told me he had a wife picked out for me. I said I would like to see the old gal, but she has to be something extra special to interest me. Keller then said, barring my wife, she's the sweetest woman I ever knew. A few days later, he pointed her out to me. He said, the woman up there with the green dress on. She heard him and turned around, and our eyes met. We had a good laugh, and I soon got acquainted with her. I decided real quick that she was something extra special. Her name was Irene Clothier. We started to go riding together and parking for a while here and there. It wasn't long until I told her to watch out because it'd be easy for me to fall in love with her. She said, John, don't fight it. I didn't fight it. We fell in love and were married on April 4th, 1963. Well, here it is, the 13th of July, 1967. Irene and I have been married well over 4 years, and we are just as happy as any aged couple could be, with a few aches and pains. At the present time, we are living in the old home in Tropic, and will be until the 1st of October. We call this our summer home. We have a beautiful mobile home in St. George. We call it our winter home. We are sure lucky. We move back and forth and do not have to move a thing but our suitcases with our clothes in. We are very happy in both places. During my life, I've made a lot of money. I wanted to see everyone else prosper and sign my name to too many notes. I can think of over $10,000 that I had to pay that I did not get much out of. Others made good and paid me back. All my life I've been honest and tried to treat everybody right. I do hope that my children and grandchildren will be more faithful than I have been. I'm now 86 and a half years old and expect to live to be 100. But I might die before that time. If I do, all will be well.